Behind every locked door lies a story the world was never meant to hear. Welcome to Behind Bars TV, where we uncover the hidden realities of the world's toughest prisons, untold inmate experiences, and the systems built to contain them. From Supermax facilities to forgotten penitentiaries, we revealed the truth behind concrete walls and razor wire. This is not fiction. This is the world behind bars. Most isolated prison in America. Red Onion State Prison, extreme isolation, institutional control. There are prisons hidden behind walls. There are prisons hidden behind geography. And then there is one prison hidden behind silence. No riots, no headlines, no witnesses. A place where men disappear without leaving the state. Where isolation is not temporary. It is the sentence. This prison sits deep in the Appalachian Mountains, far from cities, far from oversight, far from anyone who might hear what happens inside. This is Red Onion State Prison. And what happens here has raised one of the most disturbing questions in modern incarceration. How much isolation can a human mind endure before control becomes cruelty? Built to be unreachable. Red Onion State Prison was built in one of the most remote regions of Virginia, surrounded by mountains, accessible by long, winding roads, hours from major cities. This wasn't accidental. Virginia needed a place to house inmates it labeled the worst of the worst. Gang leaders, repeat offenders, men deemed uncontrollable. Instead of dispersing them, the state concentrated them. Red Onion opened in the late 1990s, during America's peak era of Supermax prisons. Its purpose wasn't rehabilitation. It was containment through isolation. From the beginning, Red Onion was designed to minimize contact between inmates and the outside world. The Supermax philosophy. Supermax prisons follow a simple philosophy. Control behavior by removing interaction. At Red Onion, inmates spend up to 23 hours a day alone. Cells are constructed of concrete and steel. Windows reveal little more than sky. Communication is reduced to commands. Meals are delivered through slots. Movement is restrained. Conversation is discouraged. Many inmates remain in this environment for years, not because they committed new crimes inside, but because the system makes it difficult to leave. Progression out of isolation requires compliance, patience, and time. And even then, release is never guaranteed. Who gets sent here? Most inmates at Red Onion weren't sent there by judges. They were sent there by administrators. Classification decisions, often opaque, determined who belonged in isolation. Factors included disciplinary history, gang affiliation, real or alleged, perceived threat level. Once assigned to Red Onion, inmates entered a system with few exit points. Appeals were slow. Reviews were infrequent. Criteria for release were vague. One former inmate later said, "You didn't know what they wanted from you. You just knew isolation would continue until they decided otherwise." That uncertainty became part of the punishment. Red Onion wasn't just isolating bodies. It was isolating time itself. And what happens to the human mind when days blur into years would soon place this prison under national scrutiny. Life alone, hour by hour. At Red Onion, days are not measured by clocks. They're measured by routine. A door slot opens. A tray slides in. A command is issued. No greeting. No conversation. No acknowledgement. Breakfast alone. Lunch alone. Dinner alone. Inmates wake to fluorescent light and concrete silence. Most cells are no larger than a parking space. A steel bed, a toilet, a sink, nothing else. For 23 hours a day, this is the entire world. The remaining hour, if granted, is spent alone in a recreation cage. No weights, no grass, no interaction, just walls and sky. One former inmate said, "You don't live days here. You survive hours, one at a time." This isn't boredom. It's temporal erasure, psychological deterioration. Human beings are not designed for isolation. Red Onion made it permanent. Within weeks, inmates report anxiety and panic. Within months, memory begins to fade. Within years, identity fractures. Men forget conversations they had minutes earlier. Struggle to form sentences. Lose the ability to regulate emotion. Psychologists have testified that long-term isolation causes cognitive impairment, emotional blunting, paranoia, hallucinations. These effects are not rare. They are predictable. And Red Onion documented them. Mental health assessments noted deterioration, then returned inmates to the same conditions. Because isolation wasn't a side effect. It was the mechanism. One inmate described it this way. Your thoughts echo so long. They stop sounding like yours. Silence, sensory deprivation, time. Silence at Red Onion is not peaceful. It's aggressive. There are no voices, only ventilation hum and distant metal sounds. Without sound, the brain compensates. Inmates report hearing footsteps that aren't there. Voices calling their names. Music playing in empty air. Time becomes elastic. Days stretch endlessly, then collapse without warning. Some inmates stop sleeping normally. Others sleep constantly. Many lose track of seasons entirely. One man said he didn't realize winter had passed until the air felt different through a crack in the door. This is sensory deprivation, and it is deliberate. Red Onion was engineered to minimize stimulation because stimulation creates connection, and connection undermines control. For some inmates, the damage stopped at psychological collapse. For others, it went further. Because when isolation meets untreated mental illness inside isolation. Red Onion was never designed to treat mental illness, but it became a holding facility for it. Many inmates arrived already struggling with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, PTSD, or severe depression. Others developed symptoms after prolonged isolation. Instead of treatment, they were confined further. Auditory hallucinations were written up as disruptive behavior. Self-harm was treated as manipulation. Breakdowns were met with restraints. Mental health staff were limited. Appointments were brief. Follow-ups were rare. In some cases, inmates were evaluated through the cell door. No privacy, no trust, no continuity of care. Psychiatrists warned repeatedly. Isolation intensifies mental illness. The response? Keep the inmate isolated. Because Red Onion wasn't built for healing. It was built for containment. One former inmate said, "They didn't ask how I was doing. They asked if I was compliant." Suicide and self-harm. When isolation removes everything, some inmates turn inward. Self-harm incidents at Red Onion followed familiar patterns. Long-term isolation, mental health decline, escalating distress, cutting, headbanging, suicide attempts. In some cases, inmates attempted suicide multiple times. Each time returned to the same conditions afterward. Cells were stripped. Observation increased briefly. Then isolation resumed. Families were often notified after the fact. Details were minimal. Timelines unclear. Responsibility deflected. One former officer admitted, "We knew who was at risk. We just didn't have anywhere else to put them." That statement revealed the truth. Isolation wasn't preventing harm. It was producing it. And when deaths occurred, they were described as tragic, but unavoidable, as if the environment had nothing to do with it. Use of force and control. At Red Onion, control was maintained physically when compliance failed. Extraction teams were trained to enter cells swiftly. Shields, batons, chemical agents. Use of force wasn't rare. It was procedural. Refusing orders, covering cell windows, verbally protesting conditions. Each could trigger an extraction. Force incidents were documented, but often justified automatically. Language repeated across reports. Inmate became combative. Staff feared for safety. Force was necessary. Video footage, when available, sometimes told a different story. Inmates restrained for prolonged periods. Chemical sprays used in enclosed spaces. Compliance achieved only after physical domination. Force reinforced hierarchy. It reminded inmates who controlled the environment. And in a place defined by isolation, control was the only currency that mattered. By now, Red Onion's practices were no longer hidden. Complaints multiplied. Families asked questions. Lawyers took notice. And soon, the prison silence would be challenged in court. Retaliation for complaints. At Red Onion, filing a complaint wasn't protected. It was risky. Inmates who submitted grievances or contacted outside advocates often reported consequences that followed quickly. Cell searches increased. Property disappeared. Movement privileges vanished. Some inmates were transferred deeper into isolation. Others were written up for vague rule violations. Officially, none of this was retaliation. Unofficially, the message was clear. Silence keeps conditions stable. Speaking up disrupts order. One former inmate said, "You learn fast, complain, and life gets harder." That fear mattered, because isolation already stripped inmates of power. Retaliation stripped them of hope. And without hope, there is no incentive to comply, improve, or survive. Federal lawsuits. Eventually, the pattern reached the outside world. Civil rights attorneys began filing lawsuits challenging Red Onion's use of extreme isolation. The claims were direct. Prolonged solitary confinement caused severe psychological harm. Mentally ill inmates were held in conditions that worsened their illness. Isolation was used without meaningful review. Retaliation discouraged reporting abuse. The legal argument wasn't emotional. It was medical and constitutional. Experts testified that isolation lasting months or years causes permanent damage. And Red Onion wasn't using isolation temporarily. It was using it indefinitely. For the state, this created a problem. Because under constitutional law, punishment doesn't need to be intended as cruel. It only needs to be known to cause harm. And by now, that harm was undeniable. Courts examined extreme isolation. When the courts examined Red Onion, they didn't focus on individual incidents. They focused on structure. How long inmates were isolated. How reviews were conducted. What criteria existed for release. And what they found raised serious concerns. Reviews were often perfunctory. Release standards were unclear. Mental health recommendations were ignored. Judges questioned whether isolation at Red Onion served a legitimate purpose or merely maintained control. They didn't ban solitary confinement outright, but they demanded justification. And justification required something Red Onion struggled to provide. Evidence that isolation was temporary, necessary, and humane. For the first time, the prison's defining feature, extreme isolation, was no longer accepted as default. It had to be defended. The courts had cracked the door open. But inside Red Onion, daily life didn't change overnight. Because institutions don't surrender power willingly. And the next battle wouldn't be fought by lawyers alone. It would be fought by the people enforcing isolation every day. Guards and institutional culture. Red Onion didn't operate on chaos. It operated on routine. Most guards were trained to believe one thing above all else. Distance equals safety. Conversation was discouraged. Empathy was considered dangerous. Familiarity was treated as weakness. Officers were instructed to keep interactions brief, mechanical, and authoritative. Over time, many described emotional shutdown. They stopped learning inmates' names, stopped distinguishing individuals, started seeing cells, not people. One former officer later said, "If you let yourself think about what isolation does to them, you can't do the job." That mindset wasn't accidental. It was cultivated. Because a system built on extreme isolation requires staff to normalize it. When isolation becomes routine, cruelty doesn't feel cruel. It feels procedural. Race, power, and punishment. Red Onion's population reflected a broader reality in American incarceration. A disproportionate number of inmates were black. Many came from urban areas hundreds of miles away, removed from families, removed from communities, placed into one of the most isolated environments in the state. Disciplinary actions fell unevenly. Isolation lasted longer for some than others. Gang validation, often subjective, played a major role. Race wasn't always mentioned, but it shaped outcomes. Who was labeled dangerous? Who was believed? Who remained isolated the longest? Power at Red Onion didn't just come from policy. It came from who controlled narrative and credibility. And inmates rarely had either. Families shut out. Red Onion's isolation extended far beyond its walls. Families lived hours away. Visits required time, money, and transportation many didn't have. When visits did happen, they were brief and restrictive. Glass barriers, limited contact, strict monitoring. For inmates in isolation, visits were often suspended entirely. Phone calls were rare. Letters were delayed. Information was scarce. Families learned about mental health crises after the fact. If they learned at all. One mother said, "I didn't know how bad it was until his letters stopped making sense." Isolation didn't just sever inmates from society. It severed support systems. And without outside witnesses, abuse is easier to sustain. By now, Red Onion's isolation had been exposed. Courts were questioning it. Families were speaking out. Advocates were watching. But the most important question remained unanswered. If isolation caused this much harm, why did it persist? Attempts at reform. When lawsuits mounted and scrutiny intensified, Virginia promised reform. New policies were introduced. Limits on isolation for mentally ill inmates. Step-down programs designed to reduce time alone. Behavioral incentives meant to encourage progress. On paper, Red Onion began to change. In practice, change moved slowly. Step-down programs were rigid. Advancement depended on perfect compliance. Minor infractions reset progress instantly. Mental health evaluations increased, but recommendations were often ignored. Isolation was shortened for continuing seamlessly. This is where reform collides with reality, and isolation proves harder to dismantle than any policy. Why isolation persisted? Red Onion's isolation persisted for one reason. It worked. Not for rehabilitation, not for healing, but for control. Isolation reduced group organizing, minimized collective resistance, simplified staffing demands. It kept the prison quiet. Administrators defended it as necessary. Guards relied on it for predictability. And every incident, every outburst, was used as justification to keep in place. Isolation created the behavior used to defend isolation. A closed loop of authority. Breaking that loop would require trust. And trust was the one thing the system never offered. Survivors of Red Onion. Some men survived Red Onion, not intact, but alive. They carry permanent consequences. Difficulty speaking, panic in crowds, loss of emotional range. Years of isolation rewired how they experienced the world. Some were released to lower security prisons. Others returned to society. Many struggled immediately. Relationships collapsed. Jobs were lost. Isolation followed them outside the walls. One survivor said, "They taught me how to be alone so well. I forgot how to be human." Red Onion didn't just punish. It transformed. And not in ways anyone would call correctional. By now, Red Onion's story wasn't just about a prison. It was about power. About what institutions do when control matters more than consequence. And the final question remained. Where does isolation cross the line? From security to cruelty? Institutional control versus human rights. Red Onion's defenders always used the same language. Security, safety, order. Those words carried weight, especially when attached to men labeled dangerous. But human rights law asks a different question. Not why isolation is used, but how long it's used, and what it does. At Red Onion, Isolation wasn't temporary. It wasn't rare. It wasn't individualized. It was routine. Courts examined whether extreme isolation served a legitimate purpose or merely preserved authority. The evidence was uncomfortable. Isolation reduced visible disorder, but it increased psychological damage. It prevented collective action, but destroyed mental stability. Human rights advocates argued that control achieved by breaking the mind is not correction. It's domination. The prison argued that removing isolation would invite chaos. But that argument revealed the truth. If order only exists under extreme isolation, then the system itself is unstable. Red Onion forced a legal and moral confrontation. Can an institution claim safety while producing predictable harm? And if the harm is known, is continuing it a choice? What Red Onion reveals about American punishment? Red Onion reveals something uncomfortable about American punishment. Extreme isolation wasn't created in secret. It was debated, funded, approved, and once built, it expanded quietly. One policy became standard practice. One exception became routine. One isolated inmate became thousands. Red Onion shows how cruelty doesn't always arrive with violence. Sometimes it arrives as architecture, as scheduling, as procedure. Men weren't beaten every day. They were erased slowly, hour by hour, year by year. And when the damage became undeniable, the institution didn't collapse. It adapted. Policies shifted. Language softened. Isolation remained. Because punishment systems rarely ask how much harm is too much. They ask how much harm is tolerated. The silence after. Red Onion is quieter now. Some isolation units have changed. Some inmates have been released. Some policies rewritten. But silence doesn't mean accountability. The men who lost years in isolation don't get them back. The psychological damage doesn't disappear. And the system that allowed it still exists, not just here, but across the country. Red Onion doesn't just tell us what happened inside one prison. It tells us what happens when institutions are allowed to prioritize control over humanity. Because the most isolated prisons aren't just remote. They're protected by indifference. And that may be the most dangerous isolation of all. If this story made you uncomfortable, it should have. Because Red Onion was an accident. It was a decision. And until those decisions are questioned, isolation will keep finding new places to hide. What you just saw is more than a story. It's a reality lived by thousands behind bars. If you believe in uncovering the truth, the kind hidden behind concrete walls and silence, then join us. Subscribe to Behind Bars TV and never miss a chapter in the world's most dangerous stories. Until next time, stay aware, stay informed, and stay locked in. Until next time, keep your mind open and your curiosity sharp. Remember, freedom and confinement are sometimes only a wall apart.